Hello everyone, welcome back to Introduction to the Caribbean. This is our fifth presentation, and today we'll be talking about imperialism and slavery. So let's go ahead and dive in. Again, I'm drawing the material from Franklin Knight's book. This is chapter 5, I believe, chapter 5 or 6 of Franklin Knight's book, Caribbean, the Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism. And here's some pictures of the Caribbean. I like the old classic looks. Changes in the 17th century. As the Caribbean society developed, there were three types of men, according to someone who was visiting Barbados in 1653, who said there are masters, servants, and slaves in the Caribbean. However, it was going to get far more complex than that. The 17th century witnessed fundamental changes in the political, economic, and social structures of the Caribbean. This is the 1600s. This was the same century that marked the transition from settler communities to exploitation communities or colonies in the non-Hispanic European societies. Remember that Franklin Knight is making a distinction between islands that developed as settler communities, which develop one sort of social structure, and islands that develop as exploitation colonies, which develop a more rigid social hierarchy that's color-based and exploitive. The islands were fragmented nationally and linguistically as the Dutch, French, and the English took the smaller islands from the Spanish. And of course, this began in the primarily in the 16th century. I think in 1625, England took Barbados and began to settle Barbados in 1625. So there were these three basic changes in the 17th century included such things as, first, the center of gravity in the Spanish Empire shifted from Peru to New Spain, which is modern Mexico. And this had to do with a discovery of silver mines in modern Mexico and New Spain. Mexican Gulf ports in Tampico and Veracruz took on precedence over South American ports such as Portobello and Cartagena. Second, the orderly system of regular convoys began to break down. So we saw last week, I think, that the Spanish devised this convoy system where La Flota would depart from Havana to go back to Spain once a year with all the ships together in one convoy, and that was a means of protection from pirates, from Buccaneers, from attacks from the British, from the English, the French, or the Dutch. But this began to suffer disruptions, and part of it was bad administration, part of it was the continued attacks by privateers and pirates. Commerce and communications suffered disruptions, inviting contraband. The third basic change was the establishment of rival colonies, which disrupted trade and promoted illegal activities across the borders. The English, I mentioned earlier, the English captured Barbados, or they took Barbados in 1625. In 1655, under Oliver Cromwell, they captured Jamaica. And the Dutch also began settlements in St. Eustatius, Saba, and St. Martin, and Curaçao. The French also were active in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and eventually on the northwestern end of Hispaniola. Cromwell's Western design originally was to try to take control of the Spanish Empire. He specifically wanted to take San Domingo, or the island of Hispaniola, from the Spanish. That's the original island where the very first settlements were of the Spanish. And from there, he wanted to create a military base to move outward. The British were badly defeated in San Domingo, and left between their tails and their legs. And while they were in the area, they decided to sail over to Jamaica and try to take Jamaica, which only had, I think it was like 10 or 15,000 people living there at the time. And it was poorly defended by Indians and some slaves, as well as a handful of white men. And so the English were able to take Jamaica in 1655 as sort of a consolation prize for Cromwell's the failure of Cromwell's Western design. The social price of plantation economies. Plantation economies were extremely lucrative, but they exacted a stiff social price. The outposts of European imperialists gained international importance as major producers and exporters of tropical staples. The older Spanish colonies of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola were slow to adapt to these changes. The Caribbean acquired a racial class distinction far more complex than the simple three-part division mentioned in Barbados in 1853. This growing racial complexity carried a high social price. Everything began to revolve around sugar production in these islands. In most islands, everything became more connected to the sugar industry. The development of a Caribbean sugar took place after 1650 in connection with a rivalry between the Dutch and the Portuguese in the northeast Brazil. If you remember, the Dutch had taken over the northeast corner of the coast of Brazil and controlled it for about 60 years and took control of the sugar production until the Portuguese and and native Brazilians were able to take it back from the Dutch and kick out the Dutch. There were two types of societies until 1713. The first type was a boisterous, violent society of struggling settlers, prospering planters, and exasperated officials, merchants, suffering slaves, and ambivalent free persons of color. These were true colonists who accepted the rules and regulations and interventions of the home country. The second type was a variegated group of individuals, trans-frontier men, outside the conventional confines of the colonies. These were stateless people who had turned their backs or had on their national states, or had the backs of their countries turned on them. These include Maroons, escaped slaves, and defiant stateless Buccaneers or freebooters. The Buccaneers or freebooters ranks were swelled by many indentured servants from places like Barbados and Jamaica, who had been brought under false pretenses and found themselves in terrible, harsh conditions of labor. In some cases, they were kidnapped in Bristol and carried against their will to the British colonies, the English colonies, in order to work under slave-like conditions. They often ran off and became freebooters or buccaneers. First, let's talk about the Maroon communities. And the picture there on the right are the Jamaican Maroons led by Cudjoe, signing a peace treaty in 1738 with the English authorities of Jamaica. And so sometimes the Maroon communities were successful enough that they were able to arrange peace structures with the national state. The Maroons formed the most successful alternative type of European colonial society. The word Maroon first applied to range cattle who escaped the Spanish and had gone wild. It was later applied to Indians who escaped Spanish compounds and then eventually to escaped slaves. Forms of resistance. There was petit marronage, was the temporary absence of slaves, resistance to work, procrastination, defiance. They would disappear for a day and come back. That was petit marronage. The Le Grand Marronage was a fully organized attempt to form autonomous communities, socially and politically independent of the European enclaves. This pattern of conduct was potentially subversive to the entire socio-economic complex of colonial life. Such independent communities were called palenques in Spanish or quilombos in Portuguese. In English, they were called Maroon towns. In Spanish, I think they were also the runaways were also called cimarrones. Palenques, quilombos, and Maroons, some lasted for centuries in Jamaica and Brazil. During the 18th century, Maroons acquired a fearsome reputation. One of the most successful Maroon leaders was a woman in Jamaica named Nanny. Cujo was also a Jamaican Maroon leader who negotiated the peace accords with the English authorities. Macandal was a famous Maroon or famous Mandingue soothsayer in Haiti, who he was killed, burned at the stake about 20 years before the Haitian Revolution. Ventura Sanchez was another at Cuba in Cuba. In Brazil, Zumbi led Palmares in his fight against the Brazilian authorities. Palmares was a Maroon community or a quilombo in Brazil that lasted for 100 years. Because of a shortage of women, Maroons sometimes resorted to capturing Indian women. Buccaneers. The Buccaneers represented a certain stage of Caribbean development, but a short one. They only lasted from the middle of the 17th century, or about 1650, to the beginning of the 18th century. This was following the demise of Spanish military superiority and the greatest period of change. During the 17th century, the Spanish state began to decline in military power and economic power, and the Dutch kept up an unrelenting attacks on Spanish shipping in the Caribbean, and this opened gaps within the hegemonic control of the Spanish of the Caribbean, which allowed these groups of buccaneers to emerge, or Maroon communities, and eventually other European states to be able to establish colonies. The buccaneers were stateless persons who lived off of commerce and communities of European settlers. They lived off a large number of feral cattle and pigs that flourished in the western part of Hispaniola, also in Puerto Rico and Cuba. The original Indian custom was to dry and cure the strips of meat called bucan over an open fire. And here you have a picture of some buccaneers on one of the islands. Small colonies of these meat smokers flourished on the northern plains of Cuba, in western parts of Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, and some of the smaller islands. The hunters expanded their economic base by adding piracy to their occupation. The French called them corsairs or filibustiers. The Dutch called them sea rovers. The buccaneers resembled social bandits more than Maroons. They received covert support from states that were enemies of Spain to keep Spain off balance. One of the most famous buccaneers was Captain Henry Morgan, who was successfully able to wiggle out of his reputation of a buccaneer and become a governor of Jamaica, and eventually was knighted as Sir Henry Morgan. He started out, by the way, as an indentured servant. I don't remember if it was in Jamaica or Barbados, but he started out life in a very miserable situation as an indentured servant, and eventually rose to the level of Sir Henry Morgan. Alexander Scamelin was Dutch and wrote a history of the Buccaneers de Americanische Zeerovers, which was quickly translated into English, French, and German. The unofficial headquarters of the Caribbean piracy was Port Royal. There was also a time before that where Tortuga was the headquarters for the Buccaneers, but it was replaced by Port Royal in Jamaica. And I've already mentioned Henry Morgan, the English buccaneer. He was there's some amazing stories about his boldness and his improvisation, his tactics. A change in the status of buccaneers came after 1670 with the restoration of Charles II to the throne of England. The legal status of Buccaneers came to an end with the Treaty of Ryswick of 1697. The French joined the English and Dutch in outlawing piracy subject to hanging. In 1692, an earthquake swallowed up the pirate capital of Port Royal. And the tomb of Henry Morgan, which was in Port Royal, was engulfed by the sea. The age of Buccaneers was over. Many people suggested that this was the wrath of God punishing Buccaneers for their dissolute lifestyle. And there you see a picture of Henry Morgan in the upper right, and in the lower left you see an artist's rendition of the swallowing up of Port Royal by an earthquake and a what do you call it when a tidal wave of water. The age of sugar and slavery had arrived. The growth of sugar plantations led to a massive introduction of coerced African labor. Initially, in the 1500s and the early 1600s, the Indians were enslaved to do the work. There was a period of time that whites were coerced into work through indentured servanthood in very dire conditions. The difference being with African color-based slavery is that they had a term of service anywhere from 3 to 8 years. If they survived the poor nutrition and the overwork, sometimes they were given some land or something at the end of their term of service, which was not available to African slaves who were permanently enslaved. However, after the 1640s, the semi-feudal European settler frontier slowly began to give way to a rigidly organized, commercially driven exploitation society of masters and slaves. Sounds like the title of a Brazilian sociology study by Gilberto Freire called Masters and Slaves. The slave society began in Barbados and moved west. Sugar production and export demanded high capital investment and a large labor force. The French created successful examples of exploitation colonies in Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. Trade was the key to power. Colonial sugar planters realized the limitations of mercantilism and became supporters of free trade. Mercantilism was an economic philosophy that came before capitalism, and the idea of mercantilism was that every prosperous and ascendant nation state should have colonies, and those colonies existed for the benefit of the mother country, and they were only to trade and send raw commodities and exports to the mother country. They were not to trade with other European powers. That's mercantilism. No other economic issue caused more conflict or resentment than the supply and price of slaves. The English tried to introduce sugar planting in Barbados and Jamaica. The French built a pioneer sugar estate in Martinique in 1639. Remember, up to this point, the Dutch and the Portuguese had monopolized the sugar trade. The Dutch began to take on a role in the Caribbean as the organizational middlemen in the Caribbean sugar industry. Dutch ships would ply the waters and go from island to island, acting as traders, with traders with a D. And so, rather than establishing numerous colonies of their own, although they did have Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, Saba, the Dutch primarily functioned as traders. And the slave trade began to arise in a rather rapid form after 1650. And you see here several deplorable and sad pictures from the forced imprisonment or the forced kidnapping and abduction of African slaves across the feared Middle Passage to the Americas. Spanish sugar production. Diego Columbus had a large sugar state in 1522, so it's not like the Spanish were not in the early end of the sugar trade. They just didn't dominate it like the Portuguese did and later the Dutch. He had 40 African slaves working on his sugar estate in 1522. By 1526, Hispaniola had 19 sugar mills and was importing 400 African slaves per year. In order to process sugar, you have to squeeze it, and the early sugar plant mills were called trapiches, and they functioned with steers or horse or mule pulling, walking in circles, pulling the powering the machinery. Later, some were built beside moving water, and those depended on water power for their energy, and they were called ingenios, trapiches and ingenios. The sugar industry needed a continuous supply of slave labor. The international slave trade was highly competitive. The English and the Dutch actually fought a war over the privilege to have access to the African ports. That kind of blows my mind. They fought a war in order to be able to kidnap and coerce African peoples into forced labor. Later on, the English would take the high road, but do not forget that they were fighting over the scraps at one point in time. The 18th century was the peak of plantation society. This is the 1750s, more or less, a little bit before the American War of Independence. More than half of all Africans brought to the Americas over 350 years went to the Caribbean. Brazil accounted for 42% of the slave trade. By far the largest consumer of slaves was the country of Brazil. The growth of the slave trade paralleled the expansion of sugar production. In other words, wherever people wanted to get into producing sugar, they also needed slaves. The planters of the Caribbean combined to purchase 4 million slaves, brought between 701 and 1810, or this amounted to about 60% of all the slaves brought to the Americas went to the Caribbean, to Cuba, Puerto Rico, San Domingue. Brazil imported 2 million slaves, or 31% of the world market. The United States imported approximately 6%. Here's a visualization with the largest number of slaves going to Brazil, but also a large amount going to the Caribbean, and you see a smaller amount breaking off and going up to the United States. This is an interesting perspective for someone who knows United States history, but was not aware of the extent of the slave trade in the Caribbean and in Brazil. The Caribbean region formed a host society for about 5 million Africans. The total number of African arrivals in the Americas was about 10 million. And that tells you one thing, that about half of those people died. So that the host society was about 5 million, but that's out of 10 million people who actually arrived. Many were worked to death. And so this massive growth of sugar production in the Caribbean led to a massive growth of color-based slavery, which led to the formation of a new society that was Afro-Caribbean. Between 1600 and 1810, Africans arrived at about the rate of 14,000 a year. Barbados was the first English and Caribbean colony to experience the economic intensification and the interrelated series of social, political, and ethnic revolutions. This is closely followed by the French islands, and then much more later by the Spanish. The exploitation colonies became extremely profitable in the global trade. In 1680, Barbados was the first island to reach this most valuable tropical colony status as a result of its conversion from a settler colony about 30 years earlier to an exploitation economy. By 1750, Jamaica passed up Barbados. By 1780, a mere 30 years later, the French Saint-Domingue passed Jamaica. That's the future Haiti. After 1830, Cuba passed all the colonies to become the largest single producer of cane sugar in the world. The volume of sugar production increased in direct proportion to the increase in the slave population until certain technological innovations in Cuba in the 1840s. Sugar was king. By the 18th century, sugar was king throughout the Caribbean, particularly in Cuba. The first place export from the British Caribbean in 1770 was sugar, rum, and molasses, all of them derived from sugar cane. That was 80%, 81% of the exports from the Caribbean to Great Britain was derived from sugar cane. The second place export was coffee, which only accounted for 11% of all exports. In 1855, sugar was 84% of all of Cuba's exports, and tobacco accounted for 8%. This led to two societies. By the late 18th century, roughly around the time of the American War of Independence, there had arisen two societies in the Caribbean. Thanks to the exploitive plantation complex, there were two distinct societies: a Euro-Caribbean society of exploiters, a minority, and a majority of Afro-Caribbean people who were exploited. And we will end with this lovely picture of a group of Afro-Caribbeans in one of the islands. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'll be back with you again next week. Take care.